In the biogeography world, there's a push now to take everything that you learn in a biogeography class, program, workshop, seminar, whatever, and culminate at the end with the idea of conservation biogeography. It's a new subfield, and so it tries to incorporate everything that we've done to the whole notion of conserving or preserving biodiversity. So first, a bit of review stuff for you. If you look at the total number of species that we know of on planet Earth, there's the distribution. We clearly are a world of bugs, insects, mostly insects here, and then notice lots of plants, other arthropods, mollusks, clams and snails, etc. But chordates, vertebrate creatures, fishes, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, a really small percentage of the total biodiversity. Contrast that with the percentage of people studying them, which are a third. So chordate systematists, people that specialize in mammals, in fishes, in reptiles and amphibians and birds, form the majority. These are the poster children for biodiversity then. And so even though we are a world of bugs, the percentage of people that study them is rather small. People don't care about them or actively dislike them, but they like these things. And so most biogeographic targets for conservation are going to be coming from this area here. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So for instance, if you're trying to conserve or you're worried about the distribution and changing range dynamics of a particular lizard, well then that lizard has a diet of multiple species of bugs. It lives in perhaps different habitat that is determined by different plants and things like that. So if you target conservation of that particular species, there's a carry-on effect where you're also conserving other species that are part of their ecosystems. If we look at how humans have sort of caused or been the dominant force in the exploitation of these major systems, well, marine fisheries, not something we know a lot about in Wisconsin, but definitely huge, the largest. I mean, we're a planet of water and we eat lots and lots of fish and shrimp and things out of the oceans. Huge. The next three are sort of the agricultural enterprise, nitrogen fixation, water use, land transformation to agricultural plots. And then we've got bird extinctions, carbon dioxide concentration. This bar is definitely going to be shooting up as we continue with our concentration of greenhouse gases and the effects that has on climate over time. And then plant invasions, and we'll talk about invasions in just a bit. If we look at the number of threatened, extinct, endangered species for a particular group, let's say plants, we've identified almost 300,000 species of plants, and we can separate out those that are vulnerable, and then these get progressively worse. Vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct. So all of these are species that are either gone or on their way out. And you see, if you add these up, collectively they still are a small percentage of the total number that we know, but it's important nonetheless because certain ones have very important functions in ecosystems, and removal of them or endangerment of them causes a cascade effect to lots of other groups. Looking at another group here, global pattern of freshwater fish species. Number of species going extinct, and look at this, for many, many decades it was relatively stable, a steady background rate of extinction, less than 10 occurring, and then this starts picking up in the 70s to the 80s. I'd hate to see what the 90s and beyond would be plotted as, but certainly you get this hockey stick effect. You've talked about hockey stick distributions before in terms of CO2 distribution in the atmosphere. Well, here's something that mimics it, certainly. if we look at this whole set of endangered, vulnerable, etc., for different groups, amphibians, reptiles, insects, fishes, you see that this is across the board a problem for all of these different groups, planet-wide. And in particular, look here at mollusks. Mollusks have the highest rates of extinctions. It's a group that most people don't think too much about, clams and snails, but one of the groups that's most endangered in this aspect. Patterns in recorded extinctions for two separate areas, mainlands and islands. So let's bring a little island biogeography in here. And you see that except for the vascular plants, for all of these other groups, the number of species going extinct on islands is much larger. This definitely fits the model of MacArthur-Wilson island biogeography. If we look at a map geography of a different categorization here, so these are extinctions only and the causes. And so the open triangles are indeterminate, the slightly filled triangles are natural extinction. Separate those out, draw a line here between those and overexploitation, habitat modification, introduced organisms. You see that the majority of these mammal extinctions here are due to these three causes, which are principally human-induced. Notice there's a happy rediscovery of a species right here. Okay, it happens. Birds, same thing except in much more glaring detail. If you look at the patterns of extinctions around the globe, well, human effects are huge. If we look now at, this is an interesting separation here, if we look at all animals and their causes of historical extinction, so this sort of sums mammals, bird, like everything, we can say, well, habitat destruction, introduced species. Huge, huge. Hunting, collecting, etc., a significant percentage, but not a majority. And then other causes here. Same thing sort of with causes of endangerment. Habitat destruction, notice, is off the charts for both of these things. Now contrast that with mammals. Mammals, causes of historical extinctions and endangerment, hunting, collecting, etc., is a huge part of the pie. And introduced species, another huge part of the pie here. Habitat destruction, not so much for cause of historical extinctions, certainly a huge thing for endangerment, so organisms that are on their way towards going extinct. But this is one of the reasons why, for conservation efforts historically, particularly in this country, but also Europe, because we love mammals, and they're the poster children of all of this, we have limited and modified and changed hunting in a big way to regulate it, when we should have been more concerned or worried about habitat destruction. Because now habitat destruction is, for mammals, the largest sort of player in the causes of endangerment for species. Let's look at invasive species, introduced species, and here's for plants. And all these different geographic regions, you can see the total number of native species. These are estimates, and then non-natives and the percentage, and you see that some areas are doing quite well. The Mediterranean has a relatively low percentage of non-native or invasive species, but a place like New England, Florida, 30%. Canada, a quarter, etc. So some places more so than others. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of, certainly you know about this, one of the poster children, or wanted posters, I guess you'd say, for the invasive world, the zebra mussel. Native to the Eurasian region, but it's had several examples of both jump dispersal and then diffusion. jumping to the sort of central portion of Europe, diffusion everywhere, and then, of course, the huge jump dispersal via ship's ballast across the Atlantic to the United States and Canada, and then the relatively rapid diffusion spread over here. And so, again, it sort of incorporates what we know about biogeographic principles when we talked about diversity. These things apply as well to invasive species. And I have a separate lecture that I'm putting up on Wisconsin invasive species in particular. So we'll talk again about those invasives over there. Why they are so... if you sort of search for information on invasive species, zebra mussels come up again and again and again. And one of the reasons is that they are so visible and they're so noticeable, and you get images like this where they can just cover any hard, stable surface. And here you see it covering this piece of large garbage, a shopping cart, but also living creatures and everything. And so, since they're so visible, they are the face of the invasive movement. And if you've ever done any kind of work with water systems, lakes, fishing areas, you see wanted posters like this. So we always talk about the poster children in biogeography, the being like tigers and polar bears that we tug on our heartstrings to help us support these causes. Well, there's also poster children on the other side of this coin. There's wanted posters, certainly organisms that we do not want around. If we look now at habitat destruction, forests are a good example of this. And so the dark pattern are areas of native forest habitat in 1620. So this is the early parts of human or European exploitation of this continent. So there's 1620, and what you're going to see obviously is that the heavily shaded pattern is going to diminish greatly. So 1850, notice 1850 Wisconsin is still a huge forested state. But of course, Chicago's going to have extreme growth, and this timber's all going to get harvested largely for the buildup of the early industrial Midwest over here. So 1620, 1850, 1920. So much reduced. It's not to say that there's not forest here, but there's not native old growth type forest. And then just a couple of enlarged areas, first in southwest Wisconsin, then in northwest Washington, southwest Wisconsin, again a time series, 1830s, 1880s, 1900, 1950. And as you might imagine here, this forested land has been first harvested for the timber, so an economic imperative there, and then cleared for two principal things. One minor one, mining. There's a lot of mining activity out here, or there was, but mostly agriculture. These areas have gone from forests to artificial plains, our fields of corn and soybeans, etc., here in Wisconsin. In Washington, there's the original forest, 1945, 65, 85, and here this land is far more mountainous. It's not being turned into agricultural land in a big way. This has become our steady timber harvested region, the Great Pacific Northwest. Think about this in terms of habitat modification, habitat destruction. There's all kinds of organisms that lived in these forests that now are greatly reduced in number or extinct. Causes of endangerment of plants for the United States. There it is again, habitat destruction, degradation, plus a whole suite of other things, natural causes, collecting, exotics, etc. Birds. Look at some of these birds. The whooping crane, Kirtland's warbler, our ivory-billed woodpecker, and you can see their original range and then their recent range, historic range, recent range, and the collapse of these things has largely been due to habitat destruction. If we collectively batch all of these things, habitat destruction, human-mediated, invasive, etc., we can sort of map what we call the human footprint, or the areas of human influence. And this index of human influence, I'm not going to have you sort of learn this particular group, but just suffice it to say that the darker the pattern, the greater the influence, and it's what you'd expect. Places that have high or huge, very dense populations, China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, huge human influence. Areas that have had so-called first world civilization for longer periods, Europe, also highly dense, and then eastern parts of the United States, also greater human influence. Places where there's not so much human influence, well, Sahara Desert, the desert regions of Australia, the polar or Arctic areas of Siberia and the North America, places we don't typically live in great abundance or in an easy way. Continuing then with this theme of looking at the causes of extinction or endangerment, we've looked at all animals earlier, we looked at mammals and now birds, and again, this is just to repeat the same story for you. Habitat destruction, introduce species. Habitat destruction, introduce species. And then mollusks, my group that I particularly like, habitat destruction, introduce species. Again, the same story is played out for group after group after group. If we then take a positive spin on this and forget about human influence and map the world's remaining wild locations, where are they? Well, again, the Arctic, desert regions, certainly the vast rainforest regions of South America, but each of these wild areas is progressively becoming more and more exploited for mining, for just simple habitat destruction to transform to agricultural land, and so on. So, taking all of this knowledge into hand then, we want to use our biogeographic knowledge to create reserves, some places where we can preserve diversity or preserve these wild spaces as preserving habitat. And so we have a whole series of reserves or wildlife protected areas, and they usually have some pattern like this. There's usually a core area. There is some type of research affiliation, either with a museum or a state or federal government operation or a university, and then you have different buffer zones, different levels of control, and then ultimately in these outer levels and control and beyond, you have, well, people. We live there. And so this is the general plan for these things in most places, most cases, both all over the United States and internationally. But where to locate them is a different story. That's where more care has to be taken to this, because you can't just say, okay, we're going to reserve 24 square miles here or here. Where do you pick it? And so there's several rules that one needs to worry about. First of all, it is always better to have reserves that are larger rather than smaller. So collectively, if you added up the area of the little white hypothetical reserves, they would equal the area of this gray one over here, but this one is preferred because we know, again from island biogeography, that extinction rates are much higher in these smaller areas. So first of all, you want to have the largest possible connected area that you can. So when you are buying land or putting forward land to create a reserve, you want the largest reserve possible. A second good rule is that the ratio of the area to edge should be maximized. So you could have, actually these spheres are among the worst type of reserve that one would have here. You could imagine a reserve like this one, or something that's even just kind of streaming across the page in a wild, crazy way like this. But the fact that it has more edge makes it preferred to something that's concentrated like this. And for here, I want you to recall the abundant center hypothesis and that separate paper that we referred to, had you read, and we discussed it. Edges are very important to geographic ranges, and so they're also very important to these artificial ranges of these reserves. A third rule is that the distance between reserves should be minimized. So this will enhance dispersal. So notice here you've got three areas, but here they're sort of lined up sequentially, 1 to 2 to 3. They're close, but this third one out here on the extreme right is actually rather far from this one over here. And so dispersal then would have to be stepping stone model like this. Whereas if you had the same money to purchase or set aside for reserves and you did it in this fashion, then all three of these are equally distant from each other. This would enhance dispersal. And so if you're part of a government entity that's looking to plan reserves, or you're part of an independent group, the Nature Conservancy, something like that, you take these things into account. And then finally, if you can, provide dispersal corridors. They don't even have to be terribly big, but if you can connect these in some way where animals have a protected dispersal path, all the better. And so that's why a lot of times when you see reserves plotted on a map, they're really wild, almost gerrymandered type situations, and it's a whole mix of politics, economy, but also we've injected some biogeographic thinking here as well. And just as an example of this, here's the big island of Hawaii. There's Hilo and Kona. And if you look at this is an example of what's called the GAP approach. And GAP stands for Gap Analysis Program. And for people in our department, this is particularly important because this is all GIS driven. GIS heads really have taken the jump on this thing here. And what they've done, they've taken these species distribution maps, geographic polygons, they become the layers and they're overlapped. And where we have multiple overlaps, this identifies hotspots. So notice here you've got areas with 1 species, 2 species, 3 species, and then the existing nature reserves. Hotspots then, identified by these overlaps, are places where you have more than one of these species that are critical. And if we have hotspots not located in any existing reserve, as most of these are on this map, these are birds, then these are future reserve targets. So if there is going to be a federal or state or some sort of private effort to create reserves, well, this map has then informed us of where these things should go. So again, this is just one example where we take our biogeographic knowledge and we put it to, I guess you'd say, good use.